Thank you very much for being here. My name is Larry Fuel. I just have to mention that the emergency exits are in the back and on the sides if you need to get out of here quickly for any reason. Not because what you're going to hear is not very good, but if there's a fire or something like that. The title of the discussion is Dying Oceans. It's about ocean acidification. One panelist asked me if this was a bit too dramatic. More likely to frighten than enlighten the audience. And my response was, that's the point, was to capture people's attention. So we stuck with the title, Dying Oceans. I think I called it Dead Oceans originally, so I modified that. Deanna Kovarik, am I pronouncing that correct?
Dina Kovarik.
Dina Kovarik, who's sitting in the middle there, is going to be moderating the discussion. She's a member of the faculty and director of the biotechnology lab here at the college. Dina has more than 15 years of experience in molecular biology, and she also runs the project, the biotech project, the lab specialist project, I think it's called?
Summer camp.
Summer camp here at the college. So she may talk about that a little bit if we have some time. Dina will be introducing the other panelists. When we get to the questions and answer part of the program, you can stand and ask your own question. We just ask that you speak loudly because we are recording the event and we have some microphones we're going to run around with. Or if you prefer, to write your question down on the card and then we will make sure the question gets answered. I think there's a card inside of your program. So we have less than an hour to talk about all this. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass the microphone to Dina.
Thank you, Larry. So I'm really honored to be joined by two people here who are very knowledgeable and passionate about this subject. I have to admit that when I first started learning about this, I, like everybody else, had appreciated the role that land plants play in converting our carbon dioxide into oxygen. But when I thought of the oceans, I thought of them, of course, as a vital food source, taking care of Northwest icons like salmon and orcas. But it wasn't until I was working in the Baliga lab at the Institute for Systems Biology that I learned 1 in every 2 breaths we take is complements of a marine organism. And our excess CO2 is not only poisoning our air, but also poisoning our oceans. And so I was really thrilled when both Meg and Paul agreed to join us here today to talk more about this. Meg Chadsey is an ocean acidification specialist with the Washington Sea Grant, whose mission is to strengthen understanding about sustainable use of our oceans and our coastal resources. As Sea Grant's liaison to the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Association, or NOAA, as well at the Pacific Marine Environmental Lab, she facilitates the flow of information from NOAA's ocean acidification research to both the greater scientific community as well as the public. And prior to joining Sea Grant, she worked with the UW School of Marine and Environmental Affairs, the Marine Stewardship Council, and Seattle Chefs Collaborative. Mm-hmm. Paul Williams is a shellfish biologist with the Squamish tribe, where he's worked for more than 20 years. Since the tribe won an important legal battle in 1994, Paul has been in charge of managing sustainable harvesting of an ever-growing list of shellfish, including shrimp, crabs, sea cucumbers, sea urchins, and gooey ducks. The area he manages includes all of the waters that have historically been fished by the tribe, from Vashon Island all the way up to the Canadian border. And recently, he's been working on K-12 environmental and sustainability education, computer-assisted zooplankton recognition, and growing sea cucumbers. And Larry has kindly provided more information about both of our panelists in your program, as well as on the GAC website. So to give you a little bit of an overview about the format, we're going to begin with a brief video that's going to lay out some of the key issues and topics that we'll be talking about in depth. And then both Meg and Paul will make individual remarks. We'll have a short panel discussion. And then we really want to open it up to all of you and encourage you to ask questions, engage in discussion, and follow up on any topics that you want to learn more about. So because, as Larry mentioned, we're recording this, hence the microphones. So please, when you ask your questions, make sure to speak up and try to find a microphone or write them down for Larry. So with that, I will pass it over to Meg. Not yet. Oh, that's right, the video. Thank you, Larry.
You might say where the video's from if you want, or
yes.
I can.
And so, Meg, why don't you tell us about the video?
You already got your mic.
I already have a mic. So I don't normally begin any presentation with a video because you can usually go watch TV on your own. But I think this particular video, which was produced by Oregon Sea Grant, sister program to the south, and Oregon State University, just captures this topic so well and in a really well-produced and beautiful way. So I suggested we start with this, and then we'll talk to you about how the situation is similar or not in Washington State and go from there. So enjoy the video.
We have an incredibly productive ocean. When we go out there and do our research, when I'm waiting for the instrument to come up, I can see salmon jumping, that's amazing.
This issue of ocean acidification, it threatens that ability to rely commercially on these resources and also to rely on them recreationally and socially and culturally.
About 25 to 30% of the CO2 that's released from fossil fuel combustion ends up in the ocean. That lowers pH, and it also changes something we call saturation state, which is the corrosivity of that water.
Based on the chemistry of the water and how marine life respond to chemistry, the kinds of organisms that we think are the most vulnerable are the ones that build a shell. So oyster shells, clam shells, and corals.
I think the things that are most important to the public to understand is that what this issue is threatening is some of our food supply. There are people's livelihoods and generations of watermen who rely on producing oysters and other shellfish. So when we talk about ocean acidification, what we're talking about is a change in carbonate chemistry of the ocean due to the increase in atmospheric CO2 from fossil fuel combustion, as well as other local processes that change that chemistry. And so the issue comes in is that we're changing that chemistry faster than we have in the last million years in the Earth's history. And that's having predictable consequences on the chemistry as well as consequences on the organisms that we're just starting to understand now.
So we've identified the Oregon coast as one of these early impact systems. So our chemistry is already changing and has changed dramatically.
The waters that reach Oregon's coast, if you stand on the coast and look out and see this great blue expanse, you think, oh, that's just one big bathtub of water. You're not quite sure what's there, where it's coming from. But over the years, we understand very well how that water gets there. And that water reaches Oregon's shore from far across the North Pacific, off to the northeast of Japan, actually. When it's at the atmosphere, it gets the oxygen and the CO2 from the atmosphere mixed into it. It's cold enough there that the water gets dense or heavy and it sinks down to beneath the waves to about a couple hundred meters and starts this long journey across the North Pacific. And there are actually two branches. One of them comes across the northern Gulf of Alaska. Another one takes this amazingly convoluted route. Along that path, the oxygen gets lower, the CO2 goes up, the pH goes down, it gets more acidic before it reaches Oregon shores. So if you think about the rising CO2 levels in the atmosphere, the water we're seeing at depth off Oregon has the signature of many decades ago.
Even if we absolutely stop the CO2 emissions today and cap the atmospheric levels, there's still a 30 to 50 year increase we're going to see before that carbon, at least along our coast, works its way out.
The effects that we're seeing, the changes that we're seeing in the chemistry of the ocean that affects everything there, all living things and non-living things also, are changing it in ways that are going to adversely affect the things that people care about, because it's affecting the creatures that live there and their habitat.
The oyster industry in the Pacific Northwest has already seen significant losses in production in oyster hatcheries. And so what it's meant to the oyster industry is approximated about $110 million in production losses. OSU has really sort of been a leader on this topic, and it's a bit out of necessity. And so the oyster industry really contacted Burke Hales and myself to understand what was happening in these oyster hatcheries and try to explore what's driving these problems. And so because of this upwelling system starts with CO2 levels that are higher to begin with and puts us closer to those thresholds for the organisms, they've had to deal with these problems kind of right off the bat. And so we've had this really productive industry academic partnership that has allowed us both to sort of provide information and applied research to let the industry increase production and deal with some of those losses in different mitigation adaptation strategies, but also do some really good fundamental basic research on understanding those responses.
At Whiskey Creek in about 2007, suddenly the hatchery where they produce the tiny larval oyster that are sold to the growers that actually produce the commercial product, the hatchery was unable to produce those, could not meet their demand, and effectively they were producing no commercially viable larvae.
When we first saw this problem, of course we'd never seen anything like this there before, where you lose all the larvae in the hatchery on a given day. We saw some die-offs that we'd never seen before, and it really scared us.
What we found is that what almost entirely determined the success of a hatch, of a spawn, was the carbonate ion, or the shell mineral stability, in the water in which they were spawned. And so it was a very narrow window of time. The first 48 hours of the life of these organisms seemed to entirely predict how they would do 2 weeks later.
What's happened here is basically we have to deal with ocean acidification. It's just, and it's not to say that all the water we pump in is bad. It's just that when conditions are right, you get upwelling and whatnot, then you bring up this low pH water, and you're bringing up water that basically larvae don't like. And it's very difficult, if not impossible, to grow in that type of water without somehow altering the water as it gets into the tanks. Just because we've done a few of these things, by no means, I think we're just scratching on the surface of this problem. And I think, at least in my lifetime, that we'll still be trying to figure it out, and probably long after I'm dead. I think it's going to be something that people are going to struggle with and try to make better.
One other canary in the coal mine is a pteropod. These are very delicate, beautiful, elaborate swimming snails. They are important in their own right as members of zooplankton communities, but they are also a very highly prized food for salmon.
There's some really good work being done now that shows pteropod effects in the environments now without experimental manipulation, that we're seeing the shells of the pteropods actually partially dissolved.
Ocean acidification may actually disrupt the ability of some of these microorganisms to assimilate nutrients. We're beginning to pick up some of those more subtle impacts, and it's scary.
The impacts of having these kinds of changes happen on such a large scale, and in the event that they became catastrophic, are really more than just economic. Clearly it affects my ability to do business here, to sell local fish if the supply is diminished or threatened in that way. And of course, everybody else who's involved in that, the entire fleet that goes and catches, the support services here, the supply stores, the ice purveyors, the transportation providers. But it really impacts you on another level, because for somebody like myself that considers themselves a third-generation commercial fisher, even though I don't go out and ply the waters every day anymore, it's really your whole, kind of your legacy and culture. There's a whole identity for us here on the coast that are in this industry that we have a lot of pride in, and it's something that would be an impossible to replace.
We haven't seen thinner shells in crabs yet, but I believe that we better watch for them, you know. If 9 out of 10 scientists of pretty good reputation are all telling us the same thing, why is it so hard for us not to believe them, or at least give it a shot? You know, what if we're wrong? What if we're wrong and we don't react appropriately? Things are going to change big time. We have an obligation, I think, to do what we can do to understand and mitigate damages and correct trends that are negative. You know, our existence might rely on this. We don't know.
We know that these impacts are happening. What we don't know, and what we need to know, is what's happening to the ecosystem at large. We anticipate and are concerned about impacts to fish. We're concerned about impacts to crustaceans like crab and shrimp, but we need more research. And what we know now is that some of the species that are low on the food chain are being impacted, and that implies that there are ecosystem-wide, food web-wide impacts that we're going to start to see.
We're going to see changes in chemistry that the rest of the ocean won't see for decades and decades. So on the one hand, we're going to be the hardest and first hit. But on the other hand, I think it's important that what we learn today in Oregon's coastal waters, that is invaluable. There's really no substitute for the kinds of information that we're going to gain by understanding our ocean. There's no substitute for that.
Well, I'm going to talk to you briefly, I hope, about some of the basics of the chemistry that really wasn't covered in that video. I love what that video says, but it may be leaving some questions in your head about what is it that carbon dioxide is actually doing to seawater chemistry. So just hopefully 4 or 5 quick slides and then pass it over to Paul, and then we'll have our discussion. So I usually start all of my talks with this slide because this is the way I think many people think about the ocean. I ask people what words come to mind, and they usually say big, deep, vast, endless, as it appears in this slide. And I think that really presents a barrier to people understanding how what humans have been doing on land through the combustion of fossil fuels through our industrial activities for a century and a half, how it can still change something that seems so big and vast and endless. And so I always follow with this slide. This is scientists' depiction of all the water on our planet. This is all the oceans, all the fresh water, the polar ice caps, even the water that's in the atmosphere is all represented by that drop sitting on top of North America right there. And it's still a really big drop. I can't remember exactly where it's stretching, somewhere in Arizona and somewhere in Kansas, I think. But it's not nearly probably as much water as you think we had on this planet. So if you imagine smearing that drop of water back out over the sandy yellow ocean basins in this image, then you get a sense that the oceans are actually very thin skin of water on the surface of our planet. And it's not so much about volume as it is about surface area. I think of the oceans as a big surface where exchange can easily happen between what's in the atmosphere and what's in the water. And so then you can think about all the carbon dioxide that we're putting in the atmosphere through industrial activity and driving cars and airplanes and making cement and all the other things we use fossil fuels for. That carbon dioxide, of course, can easily penetrate into the ocean and react with the water there and change the chemistry. So this slide is just the core chemistry reaction behind ocean acidification, and I'm glad it's such a simple reaction, actually, because it doesn't take much to convince people that it's happening. Most of the carbon dioxide that we emit, at least 2/3 to 3/4, stays in the atmosphere, and that's what's driving climate change. But a significant percent of the carbon dioxide that humans generate absorbs into the ocean and reacts with seawater, and it's driving acidification. And that chemistry reaction that I told you about is very simple. 1 molecule of water plus 1 molecule of carbon dioxide combine to form a new molecule of carbonic acid. And that's what's changing the pH of the oceans, making them more acidic than they otherwise would be. So before I leave this topic completely, I just wanted to give you a glimpse of the way we think about acidity in any solution. I'm talking about seawater, but this is the pH scale, and it describes the acidity of any solution at all. And you can see that this pH scale, it's sort of arbitrary. I won't go into why it goes from 0 to 14, but most people know that pH 7, right smack in the middle of the scale, is considered neutral, and anything lower than pH 7 is considered acidic, and everything above pH 7 is considered basic. But really all this scale is measuring is how many hydrogen ions there are in a solution. It looks like H+, it's also called a proton. And that's what gives acid its kick and its sizzle. That's what does the corroding in an acid. And there's hydrogen ions in any solution at any point along the scale. There's just a lot more of them on the acidic half than there are on the basic half. And if this is the light, well, I don't want to, yeah, okay, great. So right here, I just want to point out that seawater is at pH 8.1. That's on the basic half of the scale. Seawater, as many people know, is basic. It's not acidic. It's probably not ever going to become acidic, meaning less than pH 7, but it is moving in that direction as a result of the carbon dioxide we're putting in the water. And you can see here that I have a little asterisk next to pH 8.1 on the scale, and that asterisk is to remind me to tell you that the oceans, until relatively recently, until the Industrial Revolution began, were actually more basic than they are today. They were pH 8.2, and they've already changed by 0.1 pH unit, become more acidic as a result of humans' use of fossil fuels and the carbon dioxide that emits. And I want to tell you that if we keep using fossil fuels at the rate that's projected, that the world is accustomed to, this pH value is going to drop further by the end of the century, another 0.3 to 0.4 pH units. And a lot of people are not very impressed by that. And they're like, 0.1, 0.2, that's not really a big change. I want to remind you that this scale, like the Richter scale and the decibel scale, is logarithmic. And that means that every change of 1 unit along the scale is actually a 10-fold change in real life. So a 0.1 decrease in pH is actually a 30% change in the acidity. The oceans are 30% more acidic today than they were before the Industrial Revolution, and we're headed for 150 to 200% increase in acidity by the end of this century if we don't quickly move off of fossil fuels. So I think the only other thing I want to point out before I turn it over to Paul, I'll just do my chemical reaction again because I managed to animate it to show people that that reaction shifts things up towards the acidic end of the scale. The only other thing I want to point out, because we may have time to do a demonstration here at the end of the talk, is that human blood and seawater are relatively close in pH. They're both basic. They're both affected by carbon dioxide in the same way. Human blood can become acidified when there's too much carbon dioxide in it, just the same way seawater is. And if we have time, I'll use that little fact to prove to you that biological organisms really do not like even small changes in the pH of their chemistry. All right, Paul, let me see if there's anything left here. Oh, this is just a sort of a smattering of organisms that are impacted because they all have calcium carbonate shells. And this is where I'm going to turn it to Paul because he's going to talk about lots of organisms probably.
Well, maybe not, but we'll see. So I've been working a lot on education issues, and this is, I'll briefly run through some slides that kind of explain how I got to start working on these. So just as for some, to give you an idea of where, here's Washington State, here we are somewhere in Shoreline, and back 1800s, these are the areas that different tribes had occupied, pretty much the whole state, and these are the reservation areas as they are today. So during the treaties, let's see if I can get this. Oh, yeah, and so Suquamish is where I work, and if we're over here somewhere in Shoreline, Suquamish is across the water, and this is a map from 1868, and this is the original village site, but they've got summer villages. They had them all over the place in all other areas. That previous map, 1855, the treaties, is when tribes gave up the lands, but they retained the right to fish. In 74, you're probably might be familiar with the Bolt decision. Tribes regained the right to take salmon. In the Supreme Court decision, 94, shellfish were determined to be fish, and so the treaties applied to shellfish. That's when I started working a lot. And then the last case, the 2010 U.S. v. Washington, the culvert case, the court determined that the state cannot harm or allow others to harm treaty reserve fish populations. And so that provides certain leverage for the tribes to, it's certain protections in terms of the culverts. They have had to, the state of Washington has put in a lot of culverts that block fish passage, and so those have been identified, and they're obligated to remove those culverts so that salmon can get upstream. It's taking a long time, though. As you'll see with other Supreme Court cases, even though it's decided, it takes a long time to implement. Now, this whole talk has been about ocean acidification. There's a lot of other issues out there with this change in climate change. It's impacting hypoxia, there's lowering of oxygen in the water. You've got warming water, changes in currents. There's a lot of changes going on that impact fish and shellfish and everything in the marine environment. And then there's other additional stressors just from the increase of human populations locally and globally. And so there's this whole variety of problems out there. And I've tried to figure out what's the common thread. And it seems, in terms of solutions, and it seems that the Hippocratic Oath kind of exemplifies. Does everybody know what the Hippocratic Oath is? It's the thing that doctors take. They say we're not going to do any harm. That is what they say, right? Before they practice, they don't. The goal is not to harm the patient, and that is first do no harm. Here's the Hippocratic Oath. So that's the main problem: is that humans are simply if we could change human behavior so we don't do harm to the environment, ecosystems will recover. They will regain resilience, and then they'll be able to be better able to withstand the changes that are occurring from ocean acidification and climate change and that sort of thing. So what types of things can humans do? I was going to ask you guys, but I'll just run through them. Our energy source, of course, is a big deal. Where we live, how we build, how we move around, transportation, what we consume, how we get rid of our waste. These are some of the human behaviors that will change. Yes? Yes, exactly. Mm-hmm. Exactly. And so there's ways to change behavior. The scientists over in, I can never pronounce it, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, they've come out. These are folks from, I love the acronym, SCN, like SNARC, is Social Cognitive Networks Academic Research Center. They must know what they're doing, right? They've discovered that just 10% of the human population holds an unshakable belief. Their belief will always be adopted by the majority of the society. So how do you get those folks change the belief? We have some obstacles, challenges, information. This is back from 2012, but here, this is the number, news coverage from 2011, 2012. So many on the Kardashians, so very little on ocean acidification. So information and how it's the media is a big part. And this kind of, I threw this in as a reaction to the announcement. There's a lot of folks that they don't like environmentalists and feminists. There is a stereotype, a negative stereotype, and it's a big question we really have to look into and figure out why. How can we, here these folks are trying to change things for the betterment of everybody, but there's a large part of the population that they have a dislike for environmentalists. And we could go into why, but we probably don't have time. And there's a lot of misperceptions out there. A third of Americans don't believe in the theory of evolution, and these anti-science beliefs, you can tell in politics right now, the current political discourse, there's a lot of anti-science beliefs out there. So, but science education is slowly improving. Now you can't see this, but we're in the mid-range, lower mid-range globally. There's lots of countries we're above, right, in terms of mathematics and science. Here we are down here. We used to be worse. We're improving slowly. I've been promoting education a lot. It's a great opportunity. We already have all these institutions. It's a matter of reaching those students. To reach those students, you get to the teachers. Very effective way to communicate a lot of good information. The standards are changing. Next-gen science standards have come into effect. Those are K-12 standards. And teachers want high-quality materials. Also, the government supports, climate change and ocean acidification education. Supreme Court case, McCleary, the Washington State Supreme Court found that education is the paramount duty of the state, or it is the paramount duty of the state to make ample provision for education of all children residing within its borders. And they found that Washington State is not doing this. And they've got the legislature is in contempt of court. I think they're fining them, what is it?
100,000 a day.
100,000 a day, because the Washington State is not educating everybody here, right? So we started this ocean acidification curriculum collection, the sortable online database, try to get the high quality OA materials out to teachers and identify gaps. Now this is one thing we tried to start doing. There's a lot of things people can do, and each one of you can do something. We started this, well, if it wasn't for Meg helping a lot, I probably wouldn't have gotten off the ground, because I'm a biologist, I'm not an educator, and so I just try to do things. And my advice to all of you is just to start doing something, anything, and just keep with it, and you will have an impact. So I'll cut there, I'll stop there, get off topic, but because I want to, we want to have lots of time for questions and conversation.
So one question that I'd like to ask Meg, you referred early on that some of the things that we saw in the Oregon Sea Grant video were similar to what we're seeing here in Washington, but that there might be some differences as well. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Unfortunately, we've got every problem that Oregon has and then more. I don't want to steal their thunder, but I think Washington State has ocean acidification even worse than Oregon does. I love that animation showing how the water masses slowly move around the Pacific, because that is one of the key drivers key reasons why ocean acidification has appeared on the west coast of North America earlier and more severely than scientists originally anticipated. What that animation was showing is that as water slowly moves around the Pacific for decades, it naturally becomes more acidic than water at the surface of the ocean because it's essentially holding its breath for decades. And I said I'd do this experiment with you. While I'm talking, why don't you all just hold your breath as long as you want. All I care is that you start to feel that urgent need to breathe, that sense of discomfort, and then I'll tell you what's going on. The ocean, even the depths of the ocean, are full of life. A lot of that life is microscopic, but nonetheless, it consumes the oxygen that's naturally dissolved in that water, and it exhales carbon dioxide, exactly the way you do. Or at this point, you should probably start exhaling your carbon dioxide. So the CO2 levels go up in that water, and the oxygen levels go down. And right now in your bodies, as you held your breath and did not exhale the own carbon dioxide that comes as your cells burn fuel and in the presence of the oxygen that you breathe in, the carbon dioxide in your own blood goes up as well. And that very same chemical reaction that I showed you happens there. Carbonic acid actually forms in your blood and lowers the pH. And most people don't know this, but the reason you want to breathe so badly when you're holding your breath is not because your brain realizes that you're running out of oxygen. What it is measuring is the pH of your own blood, so it's really measuring the amount of carbon dioxide in your blood. And so that as you run out of breath, your blood is acidifying, and you now understand that it's not a very pleasant thing to go through as a living organism. And that's what the animals and plants in the ocean are experiencing right now. If you held your breath until your own blood pH changed by just 0.1 pH units, which the oceans have already experienced, you would probably appear drunk. Your balance would be off, your speech would be slurred. So it's quite significant, even that small pH change. So that's what the water that's finally hitting the west coast of North America and upwelling onto our coastline is like. It's depleted of oxygen and has an extra burden of CO2. And then it also has the CO2 that humans have been adding to the system since we started burning fossil fuels. And so it mixes with the surface water, and that water in Washington state moves into Puget Sound. So we get water that has a double whammy of CO2, upwelled water plus carbon dioxide from human activity. That comes into Puget Sound and makes our inland waters more acidic than even off the coast of Oregon. And then thirdly, because we have such a huge population living within the Puget Sound watershed, and even though we're trying to do a lot of things right, and treat our sewage and have rain gardens and not use fertilizers and things that contribute nutrients into Puget Sound, it all adds up with all the millions of people. So there's a heavy nutrient load washing off the land into Puget Sound. And when I say nutrients, I mean nitrogen and phosphorus, chemically. But what we're really talking about is sewage, fertilizer, animal waste. And all that, just as it would in a garden, promotes the growth of plants. We fertilize our gardens. We're also fertilizing Puget Sound, even though we don't mean to. And we don't have gardens in Puget Sound, but we have algae. And those algae will bloom and consume all the nutrients that it can find, and then they run out of food and they die. That's sort of the natural boom-bust cycle of algae blooms. And when those algae die, it's actually a lot of plant material. Tons and tons, and it sinks down in Puget Sound. And then it gets eaten up by the microbes that are deep in the water, and those microbes, again, are doing the same thing that you and I do. We eat food, they consume oxygen, and they exhale more CO2. So it's a third source of carbon dioxide that is making the waters of Puget Sound more acidic. And you have a question.
Do you have a fact about the amount of platinum? Could you speak into the microphone, please? Oh, I'm sorry. Do you know what the amount of platinum on average in the Puget Sound area that's being lost yearly?
The amount of what? Sorry?
The amount of platinum is the food source for most all animals in the ocean.
You're asking how much plankton is being lost?
On average. I mean, I'm sure it's quite a bit. worldwide, I've seen reports, but I was just wondering if you knew what it was like in the Puget Sound.
I'm not sure about the amount, but one thing we are seeing is that you've got increased phytoplankton blooms, and then there's a red type. It's a Noctiluca, which is a different form, and it actually eats a lot of phytoplankton. And you'll see these very large red blooms of this, and if you go to the Eyes Over Puget Sound site, it's the Department of Ecology site, they actually have flyovers, and that's how they monitor Puget Sound, one of the ways. And you can see the photos of these huge red blooms. You also see this little white, they're, from a plane they're small, but actually they're huge. They are congregations of jellyfish. And they're finding that the jellyfish are increasing over time, and the forage fish, these are the fish that salmon eat, are actually decreasing. And it's mainly in southern and central Puget Sound. It's a great site, Eyes Over Puget Sound. Yeah.
I think what Paul just got at is things are changing. I don't know that we're losing biomass, but the distribution of different species is really in flux as a result of these chemistry changes.
And the jellyfish, they eat larvae, fish larvae, they eat lots of zooplankton. They eat the same thing that of other, and they're mostly water, so they're not really a great food source for other organisms. And so that's removing a lot of the food source of the food web that then would go towards the other species.
I'd like to ask a question about the funding issue that you brought up and how important it is to fund education, which I'm not arguing with, but putting education against other funding is probably what's going to happen in the next budget cycle. This last budget cycle, MODCA funds were not replaced by the state this year, so things like stormwater work that the cities do and that type of thing are not being funded by the state. Public participation grants for communities to be involved in cleanups in their areas are not being funded by the state. And these are trade-offs that are being made in our state government right now. Next cycle is going to be McCleary, which is going to be this giant sucking sound all across state budget because they have to do something and they put it off for so long.
Yeah.
So it's a false choice, I believe, to be able to say we have to fund education, so we take EPA or ecology money away and we take all these other things away because that doesn't help jobs, and that's the rhetoric that we hear out there. The reality is that we still need to clean up sites. We need to clean up orphan sites. The cities need to have help to do that work. Stormwater control and that type of stuff. In Puget Sound, the work is basically stopped right now because there is no funding for it. Now, when there was money in the Model Toxics Act fund, the MODCA fund, the state didn't hesitate in taking that money into the general budget. But now that there wasn't enough because gas prices are so low, it's not being replaced.
Yeah.
So how do we get into a situation of not having that false choice?
I think Washington State's one of the only states that doesn't have an income tax. When you look at the funding models historically, education's underfunded. You have levies in some areas. Those levies, if you happen to be in a high-income area, you're going to have better education because the local area might support it, and they'd have more money to support it. Higher property taxes in those areas, so you also have this disparity between rich and poor areas in terms of educational funding. So that becomes it's an equity issue. But I don't have the answer, any of those answers. If you think long-term behaviors, ocean acidification is a long-term phenomena. Climate change, these are long-term behaviors. And the changes that have to occur need to be supported by the public. And Right now, a lot of the public, and you can see in the educational level that it's not that high in the scientific education. There's a lot of disinformation out there. And I kind of have a core belief that if people have better science education, can really understand what's going on logically and understand this stuff, then they will make better choices. And it's a long-term issue, I think. And so start low, start now. Maybe 15, 20 years we'll have a better educated, and it doesn't, then the question is, well, will the environment survive in the meantime? Mm-hmm. And that is what a lot of people are trying to ensure. They're working on those things, but we can do more than one thing at a time. And I think it's a false problem. I think maybe you were getting at, there's a lot of money in this Washington state. There's a tremendous amount of resources. Why are we having to decide between education and, clean water? I think that's a false choice.
You spoke multiple times about behaviors and things like that. So what are some of the things that people in the room can take away as in terms of what can they do? What are actionable things that they can do today, tomorrow, next week, next year, that collectively they can be part of that 10% that'll have a positive impact on ocean acidification?
Well,
do you want to take that?
I think
I'll just wait until Paul's done.
Collective actions, I think, are really key. Finding that collective action is the challenge. Once you find it, I think just stick with it. So I'm not sure what that action is. I think it depends on who you are, what you decide to do. But find people who are interested like you are, and start something. Yeah, there was a question out here we wanted.
I have a question about your ocean acidification curriculum. Is that available online?
Yes, it's oacurriculumcollection.org, and I apologize I didn't bring the little book cards we have for it. OA Curriculum Collection.
Actually.
.org.
Oh, I don't do
And
that.
then
Before we go to the next question,
Solutions.
I put my favorite cartoon that I did not create on chairs, and take one if you didn't get one. Not only does that cartoon sort of say everything that really you need to say in an elevator speech about OA, but at the bottom, it lists one very important thing that people really, really need to do, and this relates to the point Paul was just making about acting collectively, and I think by that he means don't just change your own behavior. It's a wonderful thing to do, and sometimes it makes you feel better, but it doesn't have enough of an impact to basically get the planet where it needs to go quickly enough. So everything that you might consider doing yourself, try to think about how you can do it, how you can get 20 more people to do it with you. But the last panel in this cartoon says, what can you do about ocean acidification? Write a letter or email to a politician and express your concern. And the little squid that's writing the letter in the bottom, there are arrows pointing towards it. It says, easy, lazy, surprisingly effective. I might add boring. I don't like writing letters to politicians either. I spend way too much time agonizing over my wording, and I'm not sure who reads it, but those do get counted, and seriously, they're looking to see what the elector, what their public is concerned about, because of course that's what's going to get them reelected. So if you make the point that we need to do something to transition quickly off of fossil fuels in our state, and fortunately at the moment we have a governor who's quite sympathetic to that, that will really help. So that's a key thing you can do. The website at the bottom of the cartoon is Washington Sea Grant's ocean acidification sort of everything page, and on that page I have a little box that I call my action page, and you can click to it and it will tell you what you can do individually and collectively about OA. So thank you. Now you had a question, I wanted to. Thanks for waiting.
Thank you.
Wow.
Thank you. My question is, when we say something is wrong or something is changing, I believe we should have to have scientific proof. So my question is, do we have, we should have to compare with something. Do we have scientific proof, at least for 50 years or 70 years back in the days, how much was the acid level of our ocean here? And we should have to have a comparison in order to follow it. I like that. So do we have those kinds of studies? And when was the scientists studying about the ocean level acidification?
So,
Thank you.
Keeling, we didn't bring up that curve. It's about the measurements over time, and we didn't put that slide up, but I think it was 1960, 59, 60. They were actually considering using the ocean to sequester carbon. They realized that there was so much carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere, we need to do something about it. So what about putting it into the ocean? So they started studying it. Keeling started studying this in Hawaii, started taking very precise measurements of atmospheric carbon dioxide and ocean carbon dioxide back in the 60s. And you can see the graph. I mean, it just keeps going up and up and up and up. You know, there's variation each year, but the trend is very clear. Just keeps going up. So Keeling is the source.
Here on fortunately, there are a lot of scientists doing amazing work with not much funding to try and document not only what's changing right now, but what you spoke about, what things used to be like, and how do we know that what we're seeing today is different from the past, and is it due to people? I think it's more than 9 out of 10 scientists at this point. It's up there in the 98%, agree that this is real. And they've been able to even determine just on our west coast how much of the change, how much of the decrease in pH is specifically due to human activity versus other natural processes. And it's pretty conclusive that we are doing it, and it's significant and it's predictable and measurable. So we can also say that if we keep doing what we're doing, we know it's going to get this much worse in the next decade, in the next 20 years. And half of the West, one of the shocking little factoids to come out of this research or predictions is that by 2050, we don't even have to wait till the end of this century, by 2050, the nearshore environment all along the California current, which runs from Alaska to the bottom of California and into Mexico, will be inhospitable to animals that make their shells out of calcium carbonate. That's all the creatures you saw in that video, coral reefs, a lot more. 50% of every year.
Half the year. And then there's another point, I think, tied with that. You can measure the chemistry of the water, but what's really hard is measuring how the biology, how the animals react to that changing chemistry. That's a huge, and there are some that say, well, we really have to understand how everything is going to react before we take some action. That's, a very poor idea because, and that's, I think, one of the, working with tribes for so many years, that's one of the things, it's like they are used to observing nature. They've been here 5,000, 10,000 years and watching changes in nature. They know that if there's a fundamental change going on, there is going to be a reaction and you need to do something. You don't have to wait and see exactly how each and every species is going to react and when. So, it's a fundamental change and we need to take care of it. But it doesn't mean that everything is going to die out there. There are shifts, there are changes, and people have to, that's the challenge, is how do you react? I know everybody's got to leave, but how to react, what do you do when you don't know exactly what's going to happen in the future?
Okay, I think we have to leave it there because we're going to get kicked out of the room. But please give another round of applause to May, Paul, and Gina.